Good afternoon and welcome to Lunchtime Series with me, Kevin Britz, leading the charge with insights, information, and ultimately effective results in everything coaching, leadership, and marketing. Please remember to like and share our channel and help us grow even further, guys. Joining me in today's leadership and marketing segment, Craig Pagely. How you doing, Craig?
Kevin, yeah, good. Thank you. Yeah, I've been a busy week, really pushing hard on the business development stuff, as you are too. But yeah, very excited to be chatting today on this, our 200th episode of our Lunchtime Marketing Series.
Craig, I tell you, because I pay so much attention to what podcasting, how important consistency is for podcasting. We are by far one of the best podcasts on the planet because it is one of the most difficult things that people struggle. Like many people have a podcast, many people do not have 225 episodes of the section.
And hopefully it dials up properly when we get that entrepreneurship TV show going, because we can flip into that particular proposition then. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all just waiting to land right now.
Yes.
Craig, as we start this week's conversation, give us a quick recap of what we've been discussing for the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, Kevin, thanks. So last week we focused on the topic of why leaders actually miss the mark when giving feedback. And this was built on the previous conversation where we interrogated the importance of emotional intelligence, and there was a lovely correlation between the two. I mean, I came across the article titled 14 Mistakes Leaders Make When Giving Feedback in the Ask the Experts section of fastcompany.com. And the article was published as recently as the 29th of September this year, so really good, fresh content. A key summary of the topic notes that, Kevin, the primary reason for getting it wrong is that giving feedback is both technical skill and an emotional act. And when leaders are not just managing content or in terms of what to say, but tone, timing, relationship, and psychological safety. So actually a basket of requirements there. 4 other points to be aware of on this topic are noted as follows. So the first here is that we often combine impact with intent. And in this instance, leaders may intend to help, but actually the way that they provide the feedback and the way the feedback's framed or delivered actually makes the recipient feel judged or attacked. And we unpacked that in a lot of detail last week. We also note that many leaders default to habits or what feels comfortable rather than actually adapting to the person and the context that's in front of them. A key point is that the feedback conversations are often asymmetrical. In this instance, leaders often hold more power, and the speaker must rather navigate the gaps with care. And then finally, because feedback is emotional, even when the content is just behavioral, the recipient's ego, identity, stresses, context to actually play a role all have a real negative impact. And this misstep or tone or timing can absolutely overshadow what they intend to say or need to say, Kevin.
Yeah, it was a nice recap of some really important leadership conversation, guys. So go and check it out on the YouTube channel or wherever you find your podcasting. Craig, so moving into what's in store for today, what are we chatting about?
Yeah, Kevin, I want to discuss the topic of ambiguity, but specifically in the context of business, which often may seem somewhat of a contradiction as success in business is very much predicated around clarity or decisiveness. However, I came across an article titled "When Ambiguity is a Better Strategy Than Clarity" in the Leadership Now section of fastcompany.com. The article was co-authored by Matt Abrams and Martin Reeve, and again published recently, end of September. The best way to set the context to this rather interesting topic is to actually reference the opening 2 paragraphs of the article, which read as follows. Sam Walton, founder of Walmart, declared, "Clear communication is necessary to manage success. The paradigmatic virtues of clarity and completeness have long guided how we define successful business communication. This traditional insistence on precision and transparency is pervasive, guiding our endeavors to craft effective messages. However, as we peel back the layers of this deeply entrenched notion, it becomes apparent that both our personal and professional endeavors often benefit from a more nuanced approach. Ambiguity, often stigmatized as a hallmark of miscommunication and inefficiency, can actually serve as a strategic tool." And then, Kevin, the article just, we're going to go deep into that, unpacks the values of strategic ambiguity, and we're going to get you to explore how and when it can be deployed effectively. But how's that for a topic?
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating one, because one of the premises that's especially when you come from a neurolinguistic perspective, is vague and ambiguous language is only used in sales. So it's, and very often really well-oiled sales teams use ambiguity to coax people into believing that they want to buy something. That's why they use that approach. But I've never heard of it used in the sentiment of a strategic tool or a strategic
Yes.
approach. So it's going to be interesting to unpack this. So why would leaders consider using ambiguity as a tactic?
Kevin, so it goes without saying that ambiguity is usually seen as a risk or a problem in leadership, but many academics and scholars actually believe that it can be a deliberate tactic. And I did some further investigations outside of the article we reference on this point, and came across 6 other references that answer this question. So let's take a quick look at these 6 before diving into the article. Using ambiguity intentionally, which is often called strategic ambiguity, it allows the leader to firstly enable flexibility and adaptation. And here we learn that when environments are rapidly changing or uncertain, ambiguity gives latitude for subordinates to interpret direction in ways that fit their contexts. Leaders signal broad goals but leave details open so that the teams can actually adapt to local conditions. So there's a positive in that particular sense. It also allows leaders to foster ownership and innovation. And Kevin, here we learn that when direction isn't overly prescribed, people actually feel more agency to interpret how to execute the vision. And this inevitably can stimulate much more experimentation, creative solution, and inevitably lead to innovation. It also allows leaders to manage divergent stakeholder interests. And here we learn that in pluralistic or politically sensitive contexts, specifying too much can actually alienate or provoke opposition from some stakeholders. Here, ambiguity lets different groups read the leader's message in ways that actually preserve legitimacy across all of these potential fractional lines.
That's what makes it such an interesting conversation, especially if you have a leader who's well equipped with language and
Yes.
knows how to deliver a message, but leaving it with ambiguity too, so that there is a translation of it at different levels, and using it as a tactic, because it can elicit thinking and questioning and probing into ways that we don't anticipate. So I
Yeah.
think a leader who really, does it well will use it as a skill set.
Now, I like that add on. So the fourth reason is that it actually allows leaders to preserve, cover, or deniability. And this I found is quite an interesting point, Kevin. Yeah, we learn that ambiguity gives leaders political cover. For instance, if outcomes are poor, one can argue that the direction was vaguely stated. And if outcomes are good, one can claim credit for that direction. Another reason is that ambiguity allows leaders to actually balance this clarity with adaptability in strategic communication. Again, communication being key in this proposition. Leaders often face tension. Too much specificity stifles initiatives, and too little, people feel lost with no direction, Kevin. Strategic ambiguity here is a way to promote the concept of a unified diversity. And I really like the concept of that as a term. And then finally, ambiguity allows leaders to cultivate narrative and symbolic power. Here we learn that ambiguous language, for instance, the use of metaphors, the vision statements we're so familiar with, or even the slogans of brands, these can be powerful because they are symbolic in nature, and they invite stakeholders to project their own aspirations onto that particular proposition. And this helps mobilize the broader commitment, even from diverse constituents in the conversation, Kevin. And just to bear reference to those, at least to bear credit to the references, these were published either in Sage USA, ResearchGate, or found in Oxford Academic.
Craig, and so it's a lot of the times when people ask, what part of my background is, and, neurolinguistics is one of them. And part of
Yes.
some people, if they have the wrong side of that conversation, they very often think that it's manipulation. And now, because language is what it is, when you use the vague ambiguity kind of approach to what it is you're sharing, you can get away with a lot of information. You can get away with things. So it also, it's important to consider the intention of why you would use ambiguity as a strategy, from a leadership perspective. But I mean,
Yeah.
touch on some of the risks, and you've explained why some leaders would use ambiguity. But in addition to this, can you give us some insight on the risk of what this ambiguity use as a tactic is?
Yeah, absolutely, Kevin. Thanks. So I really enjoyed reading the article, and what I did is I did a comparison through the article that actually looked at some of the key strengths of using ambiguity versus some of those obvious weaknesses or risks that you ask about in the question. And we learned this from the comparison, Kevin. So I'm going to look at sort of 5 or 6 key strengths, and then I'm going to look at the weak. In fact, let me do the correlation between the two simultaneously. So a key strength of ambiguity in leadership would be to encourage creativity and open dialogue. And here it invites multiple interpretations and ideas. The risk or weakness potential here is that it actually can confuse or create misalignment if followers interpret directions differently. The positivity again here is it provides flexibility and adaptability, keeps options open in uncertain situations. The negative here or risk here is that may be seen as an evasive or indecisive proposition if overused. The positive here again is that it helps manage sensitive or conflicting interests. It avoids alienating stakeholders. Hugely important. The risk is that it can actually reduce trust if people feel leaders are being vague on purpose. Positivity is that it stimulates engagement and it empowers teams to co-create meaning and take ownership. And for me, this probably was the most powerful of the positives. The risk on this particular point is that it requires much higher levels of emotional intelligence and communication skills to actually execute effectively. And then, the final positivity here is that it offers leaders room to maneuver, which enables course correction without loss of credibility. The risk here is this risk of paralysis or lack of accountability if there are no clear guidelines to eventually follow in a particular direction.
Greg, and I think that's what we notice. I'm just thinking of an obvious example now would be politicians. They often give vague kind of explanation, and we don't completely understand what the hell's going on. And that's why when push comes to shove, people want to get back to specificity. And it's like, why
Yes.
is it? But when you look at it from the strengths perspective of what it could stimulate engagement and creativity. So I think it's the tactical leader using it, as a skill set is quite brilliant. But Craig, with this in mind, what tips?
Kevin, yeah. So again, taking the article and some of the other references, I pulled all of the content into ChatGPT and asked it to produce a best practice guide, which is really cool because it was predicated around 3 principles: when to use ambiguity, how to use it well, and then when to avoid it. And some fascinating points came out here. Yeah. So firstly, when to use ambiguity. When the environment is complex or fast changing, flexibility is essential. And again, these are really powerful statements when you get to understand the impact on the business decisions being made. So how do you use that particular proposition? Well, you need to be clear about your purpose and the values, even if the tactics stay fairly open. And that in itself sets some parameters around the direction that you could go off course. When to avoid it? Well, when people need precise instructions, for instance, in crisis communications, when safety is at risk, or when there's serious compliance issues that need to be taken care of. Another when to use is when you want to spark innovation, exploration, or dialogue. How to use it is use tools like metaphors, as we mentioned earlier, open-ended questions or scenarios framing an opportunity for somebody to be invited in to make their own interpretation. The avoidance aspect here is that when teams lack context, experience, or trust, a lot of ambiguity can really create an anxiety. Another when to use ambiguity is when making diverse stakeholders, when managing, I should say, sorry, diverse stakeholders with differing priorities. And I think this is really some of the biggest challenges that boards are faced with in this particular proposition. The how to use it really is about clarify boundaries, define what's non-negotiable right at the outset, and then allow yourself to leave space for those multiple paths forwards or different realms of interpretation. The when to avoid proposition in this particular instance is that ambiguity might be seen as an avoidance, manipulation, or lack of vision. And that really is problematic for organizations. Oh, yeah. And I really like what you're saying here, Kevin, because it all starts with the why. When you understand why you're in business, what the purpose of the organization is, then into what you do and how you do it, that sets a really great, well, it puts in place a really great set of guardrails. But within those guardrails, there are lanes, and it gives you that flexibility and openness to have some kind of movement and navigation within that. But there's a really nice sort of best practice leadership extract that came out of the article that I want to share, Kevin. And it states that use strategic ambiguity, not vague leadership. And when you lean into understanding the definition between those two terms, it really is obvious. It's about being clear on intent and principles, but flexible about the pathways and the details. And then the closing piece to that phrase is that ambiguity should empower, not obscure. Yeah. And what are your thoughts on that powerful statement? Yeah. Yeah. And again, what's wonderful about this particular statement is that it leans back into the core of what you stand for, why you're doing what you do, because it's about being clear on the intent and principles. And organizations that don't have the intent and principles in place absolutely don't have a direction. And when the direction isn't in place, you won't have that flexibility of detail and pathways because everybody will be heading off in totally different directions. But Kevin, there's five lovely summary points that I was able to extract from the article and the various sources, and I want to go through each of these in detail. And the first one here says that while clarity and completeness are generally given the highest value in business communication, the authors argue that strategic ambiguity can sometimes outperform strict clarity in certain situations. Ambiguity, when used purposefully, can encourage exploration, lead to improved dialogue, and definitely solicit a lot more creative input. And it allows multiple interpretations, enabling participants to find their own way to contribute to the points at hand. It also helps preserve flexibility. It helps maintain face in difficult conversations, really important piece. And it implies commitment without overcommitment, thus giving leaders room to adapt. And I think the word that's missing in there for me but it's implied is that that can only really happen when trust is in place. The authors provide a toolkit of devices such as the metaphors, selective detail, reframing, open-ended questions, and scenario techniques to actually deploy these ambiguity tactics. But they caution that ambiguity should not be used deceptively, importantly, not be used deceptively. Leaders must balance this ambiguity with ethical considerations, ensuring that it doesn't devolve into confusion and only use it when it serves a clear purpose. And that last statement for me is really powerful, because if you're using it for self-gain, well, then you've just, totally gone off the rail. But when you're using it as a clear purpose for everybody else to find their own path, direction, and contribute, then you're using it in the right instance. Yes. Yes. And Kevin, and I like the word "poach" you use there, obviously in the right context. But what's really great about the proposition is it leans into two concepts that I really support, and the creativity aspect comes a lot into the conversation, because it's giving a bit of flexibility, it's giving the opportunity to contribute. But then, most importantly, the conversation communication aspect really at the front end, dialogue, keeping conversation open, keeping it honest, offering opportunity for interpretation, flexibility, and things like that. So, yeah, creativity and communication for me are two strong principles that ambiguity unlocks in the use as a strategic intent. Yeah. 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 And that's why that last sort of sentence to the leadership extract there is that ambiguity should empower, not obscure. Oof. Oof. Wow. Definitely no ambiguity in that. In its permanence. Yeah, absolutely. Wow, that's cool. Fantastic, Kevin. Yeah, we well into some really, really awesome leadership content that I'm finding in some fantastic reports. So looking forward to continuing that over the next 2 weeks as we run through to the end of this month. You too. Thanks, Kevin.